Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
All right, we have a quorum now, so I will call the May 27th regular board meeting of the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District to order. First item of business is setting the meeting agenda. I only know of one potential change. I think we're removing item B from the consent agenda. Is that still true, Emily?
To my knowledge, yes.
Right, we don't have that set of meeting minutes for tonight, so we won't be approving item B. Otherwise, are there any other changes, additions, removals that anyone knows about?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda with that one exception.
I'll second.
All right, motion's been made and seconded. I will call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Schmaltz,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. I don't see Jen has joined us yet, so, all right. So the first item then is the consent agenda. We have item A, the April 8th regular board meeting minutes, and item C, the April 28th regular special board meeting minutes. Any concerns about either of those items? All right, then a motion to approve the consent agenda would be in order.
I'll move to approve the consent agenda items A and C.
All right,
I'll second it just for discussion, but do we need a motion on a consent agenda?
we have been, yeah.
Only when there's something pulled out of it, I suppose, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, typically if it stands, it just goes through. It's by consent, but anyway.
Okay, so I'll ask Chuck. Chuck, what's the Robert's Rules of Order on that?
The consent agenda, well, it typically has a motion. What the feature of the consent agenda is that there's no discussion on the items.
Right, okay. All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? I'll call the roll. Manager Anderson?
Aye.
Manager Schmaltz?
Aye.
Manager Spence? Aye. All right, public open forum. Is there anyone here from the public who wishes to address the board? All right, I don't hear anyone. We'll move on to item 5, the public hearing for the Bone Lake Northeast Wetland Restoration Project ordering.
Mr. President and
Yep.
managers and members of the public, we have a short presentation to introduce you to a project that is on the agenda for the board to consider ordering the project for final design and construction. This is the Bone Lake Northeast Wetland Restoration. It addresses Bone Lake, which is in the Bone Lake Management District on the east of the Watershed District. The 5-year average summer in-lake phosphorus concentration long-term goal for this lake is 30 micrograms per liter. And the most recent 5-year average is very close to that, 30.5. So to reach that long-term goal for Bone Lake, the remaining reductions are 50 pounds per year. To put this project into context. Next slide. So the district has been doing a lot of implementation in this drainage area, doing a lot of monitoring, have had a lot of conversations with landowners. And through those conversations with the landowner to the south of the wetland, which is located on the northeast shore of Bone Lake, we learned that there was a historic feedlot that is no longer present that used to have a lot of cattle that were very close to the wetland. And so the manure runoff over time from the past likely increase the amount of accumulation of sediment and nutrients in that wetland. So in that top photo, the circle just shows this farmstead that's visible in the 1964 aerial photograph. And then in the bottom aerial image, you can see that it's just a homestead now. And so that farmstead is not visible, but it's really close to the wetland, which is directly adjacent to Bone Lake. Next slide. So some of the basis for this project is because of the historic proximity of that feedlot next to a wetland, and we have past experience with another project on the northwest drainage area of Moody Lake, that manure runoff over time can accumulate phosphorus-rich sediment in the wetland, and wetlands ordinarily act as phosphorus treatment for a drainage area, but if they get accumulated with too much runoff and too much phosphorus-laden sediment, they can become phosphorus sources, and something that we actually need to address. We collected sediment cores in the fall of 2019, district staff and EOR staff, and then we measured those cores about 4 feet in length into the wetlands soils and sediment to look at where we saw changes in soil type, to see if we saw accumulated mucky layers versus peat layers, and the phosphorus content of those soil layers. So in the image, you can see the dark red shows really high phosphorus concentrations. The light pink shows high phosphorus concentrations, and then green is a typical range you'd expect for an unimpacted wetland. So you can see that there's a layer near the surface of high to very high phosphorus concentration sediment, and a lot of that is muck, which is accumulated in not native wetland soils. So this gave us evidence that there is degradation of the wetland just in the northern portion. We collected cores throughout the entire wetland, which extends further to the bottom of the image, which is to the south, and those concentrations and the types of soil were more native and lower phosphorus concentration. So it's really targeted right in close proximity to where the runoff from the manure from the feedlot would be expected to go. Next slide.
Just one quick question.
Oh, yeah.
On the far south of the wetland, there appears to be a core that's almost all red. Is that part of the excavation, or is that just being ignored as an outlier?
That's a good question. That is pretty close to the southern extent of the excavation. So part of that will be collected. There's cores that are nearby that are lower in concentration. So we tried to weigh getting the most of what we could without impacting native soils.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So actually, if we go to the next slide, you can see, and these are the actual preliminary design drawings. So a little harder to read, but you can see the 238th Street on that northern part. The gray shading you see is that wetland area. So that's that very top corner. The green line shows where we'll install a 450-foot long native vegetative buffer. That pretty much follows that open turf area from the property to the west of the existing wetland portion. And so the blue shows the extent of the excavation. It'll remove 5,500 cubic yards of that nutrient-rich accumulated soil. It's about 1.5 acres in surface area, and we'll have an average depth of sediment removal a little over 2 feet. And I believe that dashed line just below where that blue shaded area is pretty close to where that one core is. So we get really close to getting all of the high phosphorus soil, but we still have to maintain the integrity of the native soils nearby. And that was part of this feasibility design, was to reach out for permitting constraints, wetland permitting constraints. So that was a key consideration. And the Wetland Conservation Act Authority has been involved in this project and is aware of what we're intending to do, and is in support of this type of project. Next slide. One of the key considerations for moving forward a project in the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District is that phosphorus removal benefit. So there's two components of this phosphorus reduction. The primary one is permanent removal of that legacy load, the historic phosphorus accumulation. One way we can estimate what that is we have monitored the 2 inflow points. Those are shown on the right in the yellow pins. The 2020 phosphorus load going into the wetland was a total of about 44 pounds per year. And then we also measured the phosphorus load outflow at that WETO pin in the bottom of the photograph, which goes directly to Bone Lake, and that was 38 pounds per year. Now, if you anticipate that a normal functioning wetland would remove at least half of the incoming phosphorus load if it had its full treatment capacity and was functioning in an unimpacted way, we might expect that the outflow from that wetland should be around 23 pounds per year. So just by comparing what we measured in that outflow to what we'd expect if it was a functioning wetland, the difference is about 15 pounds per year. So it's one way to put a specific number on what that legacy load is that we would be treating with this wetland restoration project. The other benefit is we are slightly increasing the open water area of the wetland by having a little deeper pool in that northern portion. So there is some just natural sedimentation that will occur, and that will be about 11 pounds per year of phosphorus from the drainage area. So the total load reduction from this project is expected to be on the low end, 15 pounds per year, and maybe a little higher with some of the other additional benefits of the project. And that was very similar to our initial estimate for the grant application last year, so still in line with the original cost effectiveness of this practice once we got through feasibility design. Next slide.
Can I ask a question before we go on this one?
You bet.
So what was the load, excuse me, the load pre-project?
The load coming out of the wetland pre-project will be 38 pounds per year. So we'll be monitoring at that wetland outlet and also the road culvert inlets post-project construction. And that's what we'll use to see if we're getting the phosphorus reductions that we predicted from this restoration.
Is there any way, I mean, this degraded wetland has been there for quite some time, right? 50 years, maybe?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any way to measure how much water is going into the ground? Or how much phosphorus, is going into the ground? Do we know if groundwater is high in the nutrients?
That's a good question. And there would be some component, given the really close proximity of this wetland to Bone Lake. We have surface overflow, but there will be near surface groundwater flow through some of the wetland pore water into the lake. That's really hard to quantify without a really detailed groundwater study where you'd actually put a piezometer, which is just a pipe into the wetland soils that has holes in the bottom that capture that soil pore water to look at those concentrations. But there'll be some small fraction of that. So we're not getting at the full load. So that's a good point you raise. All right, and I'll actually pass it to Kyle. Kyle Crawford is a water resource engineer at EOR. He's worked on other projects, and he's the project manager for this specific project, and is also the design engineer. So I'll let him talk about just the total project costs, and then the project timeline and next steps. And he's also here for questions on the remainder of the project.
Megan, as Megan mentioned, this project was part of our application last year for a clean water grant that we were awarded. As you can see the breakdown there, total cost is just under 250,000 with a grant of 171,000 with that district match of 75,000. With that, we had, within the application, we had predicted about a 15-pound phosphorus reduction. That being said, that 15 to 26-pound anticipated reduction that Megan had mentioned factored into that life cycle cost of about $400 to $700 per pound per year when we're looking at the final accounting of that for the project. So project timeline, next steps, we're obviously done with feasibility design at this point, and later on in this meeting we'd be looking for authorization to move to final design. Assuming that is the way the board desires to move, we'd be looking to kick that off right away, and hopefully it would be finalizing design this summer as well as permitting, and then looking to send this out for public bids for contractor selection early fall with the end goal of construction occurring during the winter. With these wetland soils, we tend to prefer to do these in the winter it tends to be a lot easier for the contractors to work on frozen soil. You have a lot less impact on not only the wetland itself, but outer areas as well.
I have no questions. Is there more for the presentation, John?
I don't know. Do you have more, Kyle?
I believe-
Mr. President?
I believe that is the last slide, so that we open up
Okay.
for any other questions or concerns about this project.
So this is the public hearing portion of the Bone Lake ordering. So is there anyone who has any concerns from the public at this point about the project? We'll be discussing it amongst the board members in the under new business, so. All right, hearing none, we will close the public hearing on the Bone Lake Northeast Wetland Restoration Project ordering. And we'll move on to the Citizens Advisory Committee update.
Mr. President, managers, Jessica is not at the meeting tonight, but I do believe the next CAC meeting should be next Tuesday, the 1st. And other than that, I don't think I have any updates that I can give on behalf of the CAC.
Did anyone have any questions that we could pass along to the CAC, or any comments or suggestions? All right. All right, let's move on to the aquatic invasive species update.
Hello, Mr. President Andrews. Sorry, not feeling too well today, but just keep it short. A couple things for you. So the crew release pondweed treatments occurred yesterday by Lake Management Incorporated. Again, Bone Lake, 4.38 acres, Forest Lake, 120.34, and Shields Lake, 3.17 acres. Just a reminder again that instead of Aquathol K, we went with Diclot, not just because of the price, but also herbicide resistance concerns. So Steve McComas should be out in the next couple of weeks to take a look at how well those treatments or how effective they were. Yeah, it'll be interesting. I was told that it should have similar results, but it is a different type of herbicide where Aquathol K is put into the water column, and from my understanding, Diclot is a surface application. So we will find out. The DNR behavior change grant that I've been talking about for almost exactly a year, I finally have the signs, the bins, and the stickers all printed, made, and then everything's put together and fabricated. So weather pending, I am hoping to get those out by the end of next week. I'll start with our 5 axes, and then again, we partnered with Chisago and the WCD to help get them some bins. That way there's consistent marketing or branding, however you want to say it, across our political boundaries on just proper bait disposal. So hopefully next meeting I'll have some photos to share of those at our accesses. The watercraft inspection program, which has been operating for, this will be our 3rd weekend, I believe. We currently have 4 inspectors, but we're in the process of onboarding 2 more inspectors, and potentially a 3rd. Again, we're looking for 8 inspectors. That's how many tablets we have, and you know, the amount of equipment we have. Sorry, but even with what we have for right now, the DNR, from what I've seen on their schedule, is really stepping up and doing a lot of work on Forest 1. So Memorial Weekend, obviously holiday weekend, we expect it to be very busy. Despite only having 4 of our own inspectors, the DNR is going to be helping on Forest 1. So I still think we're going to have really good coverage for that. And then hopefully by 4th of July, we have a full team of our own inspectors. And again, Chisago is helping out, but primarily during the week. So that's a game plan. Hire a few more and making sure that we're as present as possible during the summer months. And then just looking towards the future, as usual, Blue Water Science will be out probably mid-June doing their EWM delineations for all the major lakes again. I assume that Forest Lake will be treating again, and it sounds like both the Forest Lake Association and the Comfort Lake Association will be using Procelacor for their treatments, which is a slightly new or relatively new herbicide, and according to the manufacturer, it's supposed to provide several years of control. So we'll see how that goes. And then also a change to our flowering rush program. In past years, we've kind of treated, from what I can remember, at the end of July, but after doing a literature review early in the winter and talking it over with Steve McComas, I think we're going to try and do our first treatment of the year in late June as opposed to late July. We're only going to do that in one particular spot, I believe, where we know that it's going to be there. Just, every year we delineate, it keeps popping up. So we're going to see if that earlier treatment is going to be more effective. Obviously, the difficulty for, expanding that to the rest of the lake is that you kind of have to guess where it's going to be, but we know it's going to be there. So hopefully we see good results. But other than that, I think that's the main things I had for right now. So if there's any questions, I can
Any
take.
questions for Garrett? All right. Thanks,
Thanks.
Garrett.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. New business. Item A. Hey, Bone Lake Northeast Wetland Project ordering. It's back.
Hey, Mr. President, managers. Let's see if I can get the right piece up here. So yeah, for the project here, piece here, we have a resolution and just wanted to go over with the the board. I mean, we've had a lot of good outreach for our partners and such, and so I think we're ready to move on it. You had the presentation by EOR, so thank you for that. Is there any other questions?
Any questions for Mike, Megan, or Kyle from the board?
I will make the motion to adopt resolution 210502.
And I'll second.
Right, motion's been made and seconded. Any other discussion? All right, I will call the roll. This is a roll call vote, but all of our votes are roll call now. But Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Schmaltz,
Aye.
Manager Oknick is absent, I believe. Let me double check. Yes, still absent. And Manager Spence, aye. The motion is adopted. All right. Is there anything else we need to do on this tonight, Mike?
No.
Okay. All right. Let's
And-
move on. Oh, yes.
Mr. Chair,
Yes. Chuck.
just a question also for Mike about additional action tonight. Do I not recall when the board approved the EOR scope of work just for the initial phase through preliminary design? Has the board approved EOR now continuing to final design, or is that an action that ought to be taken? Or can you do so if we're not sure?
Mr.
Mr.
Holtman,
President.
I think you're accurate. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So do we need to approve then? We need to approve spending more money then, I'm assuming. Do we know what that is at this point?
It should be Mr. President, managers. Just trying to go back into
Is
the
it phase
board
2?
materials. Yep, it's just the rest of our original scope of work. So we did include the entirety of it. Oh, no, we didn't on this one.
Okay, you got it up.
Yeah, that was just for phase one.
Megan, wasn't it the final slide of that PowerPoint? Didn't we have our engineering costs on that?
We did, but it would need to be part of a actual scope.
Scope
Gotcha.
of work.
Was that, Megan, are you looking at April 8th? I think,
Thank you. That's, I was wondering, I was just going to ask what date that was from again.
It was the April 8th regular meeting.
Yes, sorry, we didn't, it wasn't scrolled past it. Yes, so we did include phase two. The final design and implementation is $25,036, which is the task 4 is permitting and review. Task 5 is the final design. Task 6 is public construction
there it
bidding
is.
administration. And
Okay.
then the final task is construction administration. And that all corresponds with the Clean Water Fund grant and is within the Clean Water Fund grant initial budget. I will make note that our design, our preliminary design was had a larger excavation than our grant application design. So there is a slight difference. Our original estimate for the contractor was 167,000. The preliminary design estimate is actually 200,000, but we factored that still into that life cycle cost benefit within that $400 to $700 per year range for the 25-year life cycle cost. But there will be beyond the match or the grant funds, which are fixed based on the total project cost that was estimated for the Clean Water Fund grant. There is just an additional 33,000 for construction. And that was part of the total project cost estimate. But the remaining EOR scope remains, the phase 1 that was approved was 15,938 that went through feasibility design. And then the phase 2 is the additional 25,306 for a total of engineering services of 41,000, which is within our initial estimate for the grant application.
Okay, so we have already approved the 15,938. What we need to approve tonight then would be the 25,306 for phase 2.
Correct.
All right.
I'll make that motion that we approve the phase 2 cost for final design and implementation of $25,306.
I'll second that.
Okay, motion's been made and seconded. Any other discussion? So that is a not to exceed price, that 25,306 then,
Correct.
right? Okay. All right, I will call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Smalls,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. All right. All right. All right, let's move on to the insurance liability coverage waiver.
Mr. President and managers, first of all, thank you again, Mr. Holtman, for that reminder. But on this, the insurance liability coverage waiver, this is an annual procedural, I guess, requirement of the district regarding our insurance with the League of Minnesota Cities. And as noted, staff recommends, as in past years, to not waive monetary limit as set forth in the motion.
Okay,
I'll make the motion as presented to elect
Right.
the does not waive.
good.
I'll second that.
All right, motion been made and seconded. Any other discussion? I will call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Smalls,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. All right. Item C under new business, the boundary review planning.
Mr. President, managers, so at the last board meeting, we had a nice detailed presentation by Mr. Cecilia Olivier regarding the H&H modeling work in the Bowen and Moody Lake drainage area. And as we continue to look at the data around the district, we see several locations where we are probably likely to see that further analysis would indicate that we would want to consider a boundary change. And so from that, we just wanted to give the board a heads up. Part of it is going to be with Carnelian Marine, and they have at this time indicated that they are in the process of working on their watershed management plan, and they did not want to take on another project such as that. So they requested that it be postponed for a little bit further. But we will continue to look at some of the areas, but there'll be some potential notable changes, and we'll kind of tee that up as time goes on.
Okay. Would you anticipate bringing those forward just for our information and discussion as you encounter them, and also discussing them with Carnelian Marine on a more informal basis as you find them?
Yeah, so so EOR is the engineer also for Carmar, and so they've had some informal discussions through that channel already, so they're aware of it. But yes, we can bring it to some future board meeting, at least a summary description of what we anticipate to be some of the potential changes, and other things that the district may want to consider for options with regard to management of, kind of either leave it alone or agree. But there's some complicating pieces that we can go over at the time that we get into them.
Okay.
So.
Any questions for Mike about this? Oh,
Just
Megan?
sorry.
Well, Mr. President Manager, I just want to clarify, and Mike, maybe you mentioned it earlier and I missed it, but Mike Eisensee, the administrator, is aware of the boundary changes, but not at the board level. They've been focused on their watershed management plan.
Okay.
Just wanted to clarify that.
All right. Jackie?
I still haven't figured out how to raise my hand on this new machine.
I'm not
here,
even
but-
watching for it because no one ever does. So
Just a
wave
quick
us-
question. Yeah, do you expect there to be more than one, or have you identified more than one change location?
Yes, we've identified multiple locations that would be
Okay.
considered. So,
All right, so that'll come forward in the future then.
yes.
All right. Any other questions for Mike or Megan? All right. Let's move on to the old business, item A, floodplain vulnerability assessment update.
Mr. President, Manager, I'll let Dr. Funky take this one.
All right.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Mr. President Managers. And actually, Camilla Corral will be joining us. We are quite a bit ahead of our predicted time on the agenda, and she had some other things to fit in tonight. So I told her to log on a little after 7. So I did text her, and she is in the process of logging on.
Okay.
That's
We're ahead
great
of
for us.
schedule?
We're ahead of schedule. I think we said 7:26 for a start time.
Look at that. All right.
So, well, just since we have a couple minutes,
Yeah.
so there are in the Bone Lake area, so some of the Sea Lake, first and second lakes all appear to be internally drained. And if you got to quite a high level, they would eventually drain east into Sasago County. So not really going into any current watershed management organization. So, that's what it is. German Lake, which is the corner basically of Scandia Trail and Manning, that again is largely internally drained, but if it did flow, it would flow east towards Forest Lake. So that would be up for discussion. And then there are Ashton Lake would flow north in Wyoming. And then there's another long arm of wetland complexes that come from the northeast into Comfort Lake, which is currently not in the political boundary. So yeah, there's a few different pieces that at least presently are indicating that we would there'll be interesting discussions, I guess, just going forward on that topic.
All right.
All right, Mr. President, managers, we now have Camilla logged on and ready to talk about the floodplain vulnerability assessment. Camilla?
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on the agenda this evening. I am here to present some floodplain risk assessment work that was approved in the fall of 2020. So I'll just go through a series of slides that I put together explaining the work that we did and be available to answer any questions that you might have. So as you may or may not recall, in October of 2020, the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District Board of Managers approved a climate change vulnerability assessment. And this was a partnership between Comfort Lake Forest Lake, Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District, and the Browns Creek Watershed District. And the question that the administrators was asking at the time was, you know, we're starting to see higher water levels in some of our lakes and our streams and in some wetlands that haven't historically had such high water levels in the past. So recognizing that we're being more subject to wetter conditions, what is the flooding that we don't know about that could happen as a result of climate change impacts? So the scope that was approved in October of 2020 was to look at what other people are doing and develop a technical memorandum, looking at what other people are doing in terms of approaches. Then we held a workshop in January of 2021 to share the findings of that analysis with stakeholders. And then we met with the administrators to discuss the next steps. And then we have some recommendations for next steps. So I'll go through this series of slides, which walks the board through this at a pretty high level. But if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to just let me know and I can address your questions as they come up. The floodplain vulnerability workshop was well attended, and I just wanted to note who from your watershed district was in attendance. As you can see, we had Ken Camarelli and Adam Hawkinson from City of Scandia in attendance. Kelly Dumais and Fred Weck from the City of Wyoming were in attendance. Brian Goodman from Forest Lake, Tim Olson from Forest Lake, and then Sherry Sterling from Chisago Lakes Township. And Ryan Goodman from the City of Forest Lake has continuously reached out since that workshop in January of this year to see, you know, where we're at in terms of recommendations and next steps. So at some point, that's somebody that we will want to follow up with to let him know what we're doing. So how should we map future flooding to better assess risk was the question that the watershed districts were asking. And there's really not a lot of guidance to local units of government to tell them exactly what steps to take to assess future flood risk. So there's multiple approaches that communities are taking. And so we wanted to look to local examples as well as regional examples to maybe see if we could come up with a recommendation for what the right approach might be for Browns Creek, Carmar, and Comfort Lake Forest Lake, thinking that if all three watershed districts took the same approach, that might help the county in future flood risk assessments. It would help communities that straddle watershed district boundaries, and it would help these watershed districts in the northern portion of the county, you know, kind of make an apples to apples comparison. So we were trying to see if there might be an approach that fit the watershed district's needs as well as the communities within those watershed districts. So what steps does one take in a floodplain risk assessment? The first step is to determine the best approach. What is the question that you're trying to answer? And then what approach should you take to answer that question? Because there's a wide range of approaches and tools that a watershed district or a community could use. And some are more expensive than others. So we want to make sure that, the approach that you may move forward with fits the need. The next step is to select the appropriate tool or method and extract the data so that you can assess risk, interpret the results, and then perform a risk assessment. And so the first two steps, looking at approaches and tools and methods, was included in that initial scope approved in October of last year. Actually doing the analysis, conducting the risk assessment, interpreting the results, that's something that the board could choose to move forward with later this year or next year or sometime in the future. So I'll quickly go through what we presented to the workshop or to the stakeholders who attended the workshop in January. This was the technical memorandum that we have shared with the district administrators and would be happy to share with the board and anybody else. So this technical memorandum broke approaches down in two ways. It said, here are the approaches people are using, or here are the approaches people are taking using historical data, and here are approaches people are taking using climate change projections. So if we start with the historical data, people can use existing IDF curves, which are intensity, duration, and frequency curves. So these are the curves that the board is familiar with, right? This is when people talk about NOAA Atlas 14 and the rainfall depth associated with the 100-year 24-hour rainfall event, they're getting that rainfall depth from an IDF curve. And those existing curves, which were recently updated by NOAA, and that was a huge effort, reflect historical conditions through 2011. But what we know is that, our wettest period of record has happened in the last 10 years. So if we just look at what NOAA provides, we're missing the last 10 years of wet conditions. So it wouldn't really represent, what we know most recently. So you could update your IDF curves using the same technique that NOAA did for the Atlas 14, and then you would have a better representation of what has happened historically. You can also take different values off the IDF curve. Instead of taking an average value, you can take a value that has a less chance of occurring, but is a very extreme event that happened in our historical period of record. And you could say that that higher event that has a less frequency of happening might be representative of what we expect things to look like moving into mid-century or end of century. And that's an approach that has been taken for other watershed districts, like the South Washington Watershed District and Riley Purgatory Bluff. Other people have used storm transposition. So that's saying, okay, well, if we had this rainfall event that happened in, Southeast Minnesota, say that same event happened here over our watershed district, and we put that same amount of rainfall event and how it was delivered on top of the watershed, what would flooding conditions look like? People also use a historical trend analysis where they just plot what rainfall looks like over time, and then they just fit a linear curve to that, and then they extend that linear curve out into the future and say, maybe we should just increase the 100-year 24-hour event by 20%. The reason the historical data is appealing is because people can relate to these rainfall events. It's things that have happened in the past. It's things they've heard of on the news, like the event that happened in Duluth, or you're using historical data to project what will happen in the future. The other technique that people are using more and more frequently, especially as tools become better and more available, is climate change projections. So you can look at the global circulation models, and there's numerous models all over the world. People are taking those global circulation models that are happening at the atmospheric level, and they're downscaling that data so that it's higher resolution, still large resolution than what we typically use, but smaller resolution. You can say this is probably happening over the state of Minnesota, or this is what things look like in northern Washington County. And then you can take those projections and look at what they predict for a 100-year 24-hour rainfall event mid-century or end of century. And then you can also use that data to develop projected IDF curves so that you can get mid-century values for the 100-year 24-hour event or a 10-year event. So that was a lot to digest on one slide. But we can move on to the next slide. So in our technical memorandum, we tried to synthesize the information by helping the boards, the watershed districts, and the communities understand the level of effort involved in using these various approaches. So if we say the approaches are in the columns on the left, what are the criteria for selection if you wanted to select one of these approaches? So some of them have more uncertainty than others, right? Historical data has less uncertainty than using downscale climate projections. What's the public perception or their ability to understand the output based on the inputs? Again, historical data might be easier to comprehend than, you know, taking downscaled global circulation models and using that information. There's a lot of, there is uncertainty in that information. What's the availability of the data? How consistent is the approach with other local assessments? What's the cost of acquiring the data or using the data? What's the technical level of the analysis needed? What types of input requirements are needed? Is it event-based versus a continuous simulation like 1 year or 10 years? So we summarize that information, you know, relative to one another to sort of provide an assessment of what might take more effort than another approach. And then another super interesting thing that we discovered when we put this technical memorandum together is that these same questions are being asked all over the state, and the state of Minnesota is trying to figure out how to provide guidance to make it easier for local units of government to do these assessments on their own. As you will recall, in 2019, all the communities were required to develop their comprehensive plans and submit those to the Met Council, and the Met Council asked communities to voluntarily assess the impacts of climate change and build resiliency into their comprehensive plans. And I think that, you know, some communities did do that, but it was more qualitative than quantitative. So there's a need for guidance so that people can start to estimate what a range of possible scenarios might look like so that they can figure out how to incorporate that into their planning and decision-making process. So here is a summary slide that just talks about what's currently going on at the state level. The state of Minnesota's Resiliency and Adaptation Action Team was established in response to the governor's order to do better to address climate change. And that group is working on taking data developed from the University of Minnesota to develop climate trends tools, which will make that local downscaled data available for mid-century and end of century periods of record. The Met Council developed a localized flood mapping tool that uses national data sets to predict where high water level would, to predict where, if your home would be subject to high level. So to sort of do a very general risk assessment for homeowners. And then, like I said previously, downscaled climate information is becoming available, and DH conducted an assessment of downscaled projection data. The University of Minnesota just went through a big effort to take global circulation models and downscale it for the state of Minnesota at a very high resolution. And the University of Minnesota and MnDOT are partnering in a modeling effort that will look at different approaches to model at a finer resolution for culvert design and road design. And then the Met Council has also recently undergone a evaluation of climate change impacts to the groundwater system that would be used in the Met Council's metro model, groundwater model of the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So there's a lot of things going on right now that will help watershed districts and communities take those next steps to looking at risk. So at our workshop, people came into the workshop and, the first question we asked is sort of a warm-up question was, do you feel you're prepared or have the information that you need to assess impacts related to climate change? And people were kind of like, yeah, we do. We think we have what we need. Well, after sharing this information with the group, we asked them a couple questions using a poll feature. And the first question was, are you more comfortable with an approach based on historical data and climate modeling? And as you can see, 77% of participants were more interested in using historical data. We also asked if they were more comfortable with historical approaches, which approach made the most sense to them. And 58% of participants said selecting the design storm from the upper bounds of that IDF curve to represent a more extreme historical event than taking the average value. We asked if people were more comfortable with approaches based on climate models, which approach made the most sense, and 62% said using the projected IDF curves and not running, long-term simulations using downscaled data. And then finally, we asked the group if they were more comfortable using a single approach or if they preferred using multiple approaches. And 85% of the audience said multiple approaches. And the thought there is that, the future is uncertain and there is no answer, right? There's no one way to tackle this. So the more scenarios you run, the better able you are to capture the range of outcomes that you should be planning for. And people thought that that was a better way to go than just hanging your hat on one approach. The other thing that we presented in the technical memorandum was an evaluation of tools, which I spoke to a little bit on that previous slide when I talked about what the state of Minnesota is doing. So tools that one could use in conducting a risk assessment is your H&H model, which you have invested a lot of time and resources in developing. And this is a great tool to use because it can more accurately define what's going on hydrologically and how that water flows through the system. But if you're a community or a watershed that doesn't have an H&H model, there are other tools you could use, like GIS-based methods where you're using the topographic information to figure out how water would pool and then potentially move through the system by just looking at overland drainage paths. And you can also use web-based tools that have been developed for the state and for the United States and really for the world. There are new tools coming out all the time. Some of them are being developed for the insurance companies that are trying to figure out, how climate change is going to impact insurance values and payouts. So that is actually kind of the primary reason that we see these tools being developed at this point in time. So after we presented these tools, we polled the audience one more time and we asked two questions. We asked which particular tool or method most appeals to you, and 50% of the audience said the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling. And then the second question was, what was the driver for your preferred tool or method? And the top ranked response was level of confidence in the tool. The next top ranked response was the ability to display flood hazard. And then the third ranked response was the level of effort involved. So with that, I'm just going to pause and just say that, there wasn't a strong recommendation coming out. We were hoping at that January workshop to share the information with stakeholders and ask them what approach they felt made the most sense. But at the end of our 2-hour workshop, our sense was that people were a little overwhelmed by the complexity of the topic and came away kind of better informed and happy that the watershed districts provided this information, but felt like it was too much for them to really have a response to that question. And they really felt like the watershed districts should take the lead on deciding what might be the best approach and we're hoping to get the information after the fact. So I think I'll just stop there before I go on to the recommendation to see if there's any questions.
Any questions for Camilla? So in the last slide where, maybe it was 2 slides ago, you were asking, yeah, 2 slides ago, that one. Are you more comfortable with a single approach, or would you prefer the application of multiple approaches? There was no discussion of risk reward, cost benefit trade-offs. This was just, there was no discussion of cost from doing multiple approaches in your question, right? There was no consequence to selecting multiple approaches for them.
There was no consequence to selecting multiple approaches, correct?
Right. Which makes sense. I mean, if you didn't have to pay extra for it, you'd want as many approaches as possible. But if it was 10 times more expensive to get a second one, you might not.
Yeah, that's a really great point, right? And that might be a good way to ask that question if we did hold another workshop. I think the way that we were framing it is, could you take multiple data sets? If you were using your H&H model, for example, would you pick one rainfall event, or would you run 3 different events to capture a range of approaches, which might not incur a lot of additional cost, but it would be 3 different data sets that were the inputs to your model. But I think that's an excellent question, what you're bringing up.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions for Camilla? All right.
So after the workshop, we met with the district administrators, as I mentioned earlier in the slides, and I think all the administrators came to the same conclusion, that people were kind of walking away happy that they understood better how complex it is to answer these questions, and sort of not really knowing what the answers are moving forward. So we proposed an approach to the administrators, and in general, they agreed with this approach. And so we have made this recommendation, and the watershed districts, can take that recommendation and decide if they want to move forward with next steps and when they want to move forward with the next steps. And basically the approach that we're recommending at this point in time is that the district conduct a GIS-based flood hazard assessment. So using your topographic information, your LiDAR data, we have a method where you can just put the water on the landscape and see how it flows. And you can, for a lower cost, see where you might have flooding. And you can truth this LiDAR analysis or this GIS analysis with your H&H model. The thought process is that by identifying where you may have flooding in your system, or where you have more risk in your system, that's where you can go back in and refine your H&H model, instead of refining your H&H model district-wide, which would be a higher cost approach.
Right. Right.
And once you've done that GIS-based flood hazard assessment, you're looking at where you think you're going to have flooding, and you can stack that information on top of other pieces of information like economic data, socioeconomic data, where you have schools, where you have infrastructure that might be sensitive to higher water levels. When you lay all these pieces of information on top of each other, then you can start to prioritize where you want to focus future efforts through the H&H model upgrades. So very generally, that's the approach that we're recommending. And I think that's my last slide. Bobby, I don't know if you can check for me. Yeah, I just kind of talked about the same thing. The flood hazard layer, oops. Can we go back one? Yep, and then doing that risk assessment. Having a workshop again, sharing that with the communities and with the boards to make sure that what we're displaying rings true. And then pivoting to that next task, establishing the need to refine the H&H model, where you would want to refine the H&H model, and what questions you're really trying to answer after that flood hazard assessment has been completed. That concludes what I wanted to present.
Nice. Any questions for Camilla or Megan?
I have two
Okay, go
questions.
ahead, Jackie.
For Camilla, I think. Of the people that were at the January 5th workshop, how many of those communities have their own floodplain? They have to have a floodplain ordinance. And so what kind of work have they done? They've had to have measured flood possibilities, you know.
Right, so there's the FEMA floodplain map.
Mhm, yep.
So they know what the 100-year high water level is that was last mapped by FEMA or for the FEMA floodplain mapping effort.
Okay,
Those floodplain maps, I would say, are outdated,
mhm,
reflect current historical conditions. We have talked to DNR about the schedule for updating those maps. And it looks like Washington County isn't scheduled to happen for maybe another 5 years. They have, apportioned the state, and I think they're working in the southeastern part of the state next.
okay. So the calculation that was changed to estimate precipitation events due to climate impacts to date, that was just what, 10 years ago or so?
Yes,
That calculation was changed?
yeah,
And that has not been applied to any of the FEMA mapping at all? No updates to the
Correct.
existing? Oh, my goodness.
well, not in this area, but that is
Wow.
what DNR is doing moving
Mhm,
forward. Mhm.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Well, and it just takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work and it's a lot of effort. And I think probably where we're moving towards is, do we have tools in place like watershed districts where you can do things more on a routine basis? I talked to a lot of people at the state, I talked to Kenny Blumenfeld, our state climatologist. And, he said he thinks where we're moving is the state will provide updated IDF curves on an annual basis. So that we can start to track more real time what kinds of changes we're seeing so that we can respond accordingly.
Yes,
Instead of
well, that
doing it
makes,
every 50 years or every 10 years, right?
that makes sense. The other thing, the other question I had was, if we were to do a tool like this and make it available for our partners, communities, would we have the capability of not just seeing the land as it's being used now, but what the proposed configuration of the land use would be? And then to project calculations for, let's say, for example, that we don't have a flooding area the way the land is being used now, but if we start putting commercial properties or housing developments and change that use to a more intense use, that might create flooding issues.
That's a great question. I would defer to Mike Talbot, who's going to be running this analysis, but I would think, and Megan, you can help me out, the flood hazard assessment, which is looking at the LIDAR data and your current land use, that risk assessment piece would probably just reflect conditions as they exist today. Because if you looked at where you have flooding on the landscape based on topography and then laid on top of that your future land use, there might be changes in grading that wouldn't be reflected on the
Oh,
topography.
sure, yeah, that's true.
If you outletted landlocked basins or depressions that were holding water, that's going to have impacts downstream that we can't really simulate now. But you could simulate future conditions more easily using your existing H&H model.
Okay, good.
So in essence, then it sounds like the watershed districts that do have H&H models have better tools than the state currently has at its disposal, so that we're really going to be a key element of this forward-looking climate change prediction modeling
Yes.
effort.
Yep. I talked to Dan Shaw at the Board of Water and Soil Resources. He's on that task force that's working with all the state agencies, and they were super curious to hear what these 3 watershed districts are doing. And they were very curious to hear what decisions you would make moving forward and the approach that you might take to use your tools and make these assessments, because it would be a good case study for them to explore and maybe suggest to other communities moving forward. forward.
Right. Okay. Any other questions for Camilla or Megan? Steve?
I have one question. We're doing a lot of analysis and studying and looking at alternatives, but it sounds like Forest Lake, for example, the city of Forest Lake probably doesn't have anything in place right now to help them make any decisions of understanding what might be coming. Why don't we just take the models we have right now and run a model? I mean, can't we just do that and at least draw a baseline to get people more involved in terms of what it looks like and what might be the course of actions the city would want to take to protect those areas, or at least spend more time looking at those areas that might be threatened, as you suggested earlier? Because it doesn't sound like we're going to get very far very fast on this program. I hate to say it, but in terms of actual data that somebody can use and say, oh my gosh, we should do something about that area over there.
Absolutely. Like, I think the city of Forest Lake, it's already developed, right? So if you ran, an updated IDF curve or a higher value from the historical period of record, or you took the mid-century 100-year 24-hour rainfall event, which should be available, in the next couple of months from the state of Minnesota. If you ran those 3 events, you could start to see how high water levels might change in the city of Forest Lake, where it might not be as meaningful and it might not be as applicable in Comfort Lake, Forest Lake as it is, for example, in Browns Creek Watershed District. In the more rural parts of the watershed where your H&H model hasn't been built out to the level of detail that every little depression in your system is modeled and you know how they're going to fill under these different rainfall events. That, but you might not be asking that question. If your question is more in the urban areas, you could certainly forego that first assessment and just start running various scenarios using your H&H model to provide that information to the city of Forest Lake.
Or Wyoming or whoever else would want to use it. So, yeah.
Yep. That's an option.
So is that something we have to decide as a board then, John? Or, how fast we move ahead on this thing? Or whether we want to wait until we have a better vision of the future of what might be more helpful?
Sounds like we're already building out our H&H models. We're updating them as we go. So we'll have those as we complete them. We can decide about which one of these scenarios we may want to run and working with our partners to decide which ones would be helpful to them. So I think we have some options, and I think Jackie's talked about this in the past, to be a resource to our partners with the tools that we have at our disposal to try to help them out to understand potential flooding scenarios using this new updated data that people are creating. So it seems like we could be a key element of a part of the toolbox going forward. And maybe when you go back to do another workshop with these cities, you can get more information about, at this point, maybe they'll understand more about where they need help and where they think we might be able to help them out. But it sounds like for us, we're going to continue on the path we're on. We're going to continue to update our H&H models. We're going to have them at our disposal when it comes time to answer these questions for our communities. So
I think the question that came up though, and what I talked about for the last couple of years, ever since I saw this, it was a Houston engineering program that was being used by Rice Creek Watershed. And when they had developers coming in and they wanted to, either fill a wetland or, build in a certain area, for example, this Houston engineering model allowed the city or the watershed to plug in all the data and then see what would happen in the various options that were being discussed as far as stormwater and flooding, storm flow and flooding. And I thought EOR said that they have that program. So we're talking about maybe just using or talking with them a little bit more about how we can use the data that we've got and plug that into their existing program. And then we can start helping developers right away. So I understand what Steve's saying is that don't we have enough to start using some of this data to help them, because we talked about it with them over the summer meetings.
You know,
Yeah,
I can remember past presentations that I think
Mhm.
Megan may have given about if we raise the weir a little bit on this wetland, what impact will that have on the communities around that wetland? And it's
Right.
pretty obvious that by playing around with that, you get some pretty startling results, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that's what you're looking for, I think, is do we have any real startling results that we in the city should be concerned about, you know? So
Yeah.
you won't know that until you at least run something one time and then start playing around with it.
Yeah, and can I just make one more point? And, you know, there's lots of points and it can get to be a very detailed conversation, but another reason for running multiple scenarios is just when, if you picked one approach and you created a map and you put that in front of the public, that might scare a lot of people, right? Because it could show something pretty extreme. But I think if you run multiple scenarios and put it on a map in a way that says, here's the range of possible outcomes, then people can start to use that information for what it is.
Mhm.
So in addition, run in your model, we all, how do we want to present that information? Because that could be scary.
But on the other hand, if you know you have a big potential problem, you don't necessarily have to share it with the whole population. The city should take action working with us saying, okay, what can we do to alleviate this situation by storing water somewhere or changing something that will
Yeah.
prevent that from happening? So you
Right.
actually, you eliminate the problem before it occurs.
Yes,
That's ideally what you want to do, I think, or minimize. it.
yeah,
Well, that's the point of the whole thing. I mean, that's why you do all these studies, is to avoid problems.
Well, we got a lot of things to work on. This was kind of rising up as being more important this year. So I guess we have to decide whether we want to try to accelerate a little bit or try some
What-
things out and see what happens, or whether we want to just kind of flow with the mass decision to keep looking at possible options that we might want to use in the future.
Well, I think for me, we need to get a report from EOR to see this program that they're using or that they have, and run some scenarios for us in a workshop or at a meeting. We have to see what they've got, because once we have this H&H modeling foundation, we've got the data. We should have the data that we need to input for that same kind of result that the Houston engineering system was able to spin out. And I wish we could invite them in to see it. If we don't have access to one right now, then let's look at one so that the whole board can see what I saw. It was phenomenal. And I just think that we've got enough data now. I think that H&H report is completed, correct? Or did we see just an update report from Cecilia last time? Was that a complete report? Or
The
just an
H&H, correct, the H&H model is complete in its
Okay.
updates for the Bone Lake Management District and the Comfort Lake Management District, with less detail, at least in the Comfort Lake Management District, where the central City of Forest Lake downtown area is. But the city is developing their own H&H model, and that was their preference when we've been in coordination. They like that we're doing the entire drainage area, but they will have more detail as part of the regional downtown study. But it's a smaller fraction of the Comfort Lake Management District H&H model update. And then what's remaining is we don't have the model updated yet for Little Comfort Lake Management District or the rest of the Forest Lake Management District. But
Okay.
certainly for Wyoming and for the city of Scandia, if there's areas of concern within those model boundaries and a few scenarios that are of interest, that could be something we could just put an estimate of how much that would take to run those
Mhm.
and coordinate with the cities on that.
Well, Wyoming has just completed they're in the process, the final stages of completing their 10-year plan. And they have some zoning changes. Forest Lake, I know, had quite a few zoning changes from ag or marsh area to development, especially in that JD6 area. And that's what I recall when we were talking with them last summer. So I think we can pick some zones that are in our district and take a look at what that is going to mean and what we need to do to mitigate problems.
So, Mr. President, managers, we wanted to put this before you just to see your reaction. And I think what I'm hearing is we'll work with Mike and other district staff to walk through potential next steps. They would have coordination with the cities during those quarterly meetings, and then we could kind of just put together an approach now that you've seen some of the base information that goes into all of these approaches based on our existing H&H model updates and the city's needs.
I don't know if I'd wait for a quarterly meeting to present something like this. This is going to be a major tool. So I think to get it started, we have to have separate meetings on this and get something, get a demonstration, up and running. But from the board perspective, as far as I'm concerned, I want to see what our capabilities are right now in doing what we're talking about. And as John mentioned, this has been discussed now for at least a couple of years. So if we've got some data that we can start working some practice trials on, if you will, then let's do it.
Makes sense.
And that also
Thanks for
allows you to,
clarifying.
yeah, it allows you to do an assessment too of whether the results coming out of that initial effort make sense or not, or appear to make sense. It may not even look like it makes common sense. So,
Right.
then, you got to go back and do something different. Because we also have a lot of experience, right? We've been through some big rains here the last 3 years.
Right.
So every time it rains, we know it's going to get to a certain level in certain areas because we had to drive through it or whatever the
Right.
problem was. So,
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
all of a
this
sudden
is-
that doesn't show up, or it shows it's 5 feet rather than 6 inches, then we know we got a problem with the model.
Good point. This is similar to recall in Cecilia's presentation of the Bone Lake H&H model, and the slides are in that packet. He did give an example. We did run it as sort of a test. He was looking at road configuration changes based on some planned road improvements. But right, another similar exercise would be to maybe look at that area around Scandia with some climate changes, and we could come back to illustrate, here were the steps we took. This is this type of approach, and this is what it shows with our existing information.
Right. And I think just generally from a planning standpoint, from a city infrastructure standpoint, it's important to get that chart that we saw at the MOD meeting here a year or two ago, 2 years, I guess now. But the climate scientist I think from the U of M presented that great presentation where he showed the frequency of the big rain events. And so it's all moving into that one quadrant where the big rains are happening more frequently and they're more intense, but we still have those smaller rains. So people might not think that there's really an event happening because they're seeing those small rain events. And then we have the gully washers, that are becoming much more frequent. And so from a planning standpoint, from a city, if one was not to take into account those big events and the impact they have, they're going to undersize all their infrastructure. And we can't, that's the point of all of this, is to help people avoid those situations and in developments as well.
Mike, you had something to add?
Yes, Mr. President, managers. So a couple of things. The GIS scenario modeling work can be done in pretty short order. That's a pretty simple exercise, and it does give you an initial picture. So I think we could do that. And as managers have suggested, turn that around and bring it to the board, not too distant future. We do have meetings scheduled, or have asked for meetings with our partners on the Greenway corridor pieces, and I'll introduce Nick Banks, their staff here shortly. But and that's really where we want to look at these overlap. Is one of the values of the Greenway corridor would be the flood mitigation. The counties are also interested for purposes of doing their own their own model. They would love, I mean, and so with the cities, if we could hand them over the H&H modeling to their own engineers. And I think that's why Mr. Goodman is interested in what we're doing. So then they could utilize that, and we would gladly turn it over. Scandia was particularly interested in what would a 10-inch event look like, for example. What would it do to the surrounding community areas? And, could we or should we send something out to notify people that might be subject to some level of flooding, or at the very least inform future residents that are considering building in a location that they may be subject to flooding if they had a 10-inch event. But we know that the events are much higher in the region. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, we've had multiple rain events that have been 16, 17 inches. So they are out there, and they are very recent. So it's the reason that many of our home insurance have gone up, the intensity and the frequency of these storms that are occurring in the upper Midwest. As Camilla noted, that a lot of these events have occurred in the last just several years. 2 of these 16 events occurred up in northern Wisconsin, Bayfield and Ashland County, where I'm from. And I mean, there were roads that they didn't have fixed from the first one by the time the second one came around. Mm-hmm. So these are extremely devastating, and that's a very rural, wooded. I mean, it should have lots of capacity for storage, but it was still overwhelming for a lot of the highways and infrastructure from that standpoint. So that's, I think, is the key value of this. For the city of Forest Lake, it gets a lot more complex because of their MS4 infrastructure. We've been trying to work with them on getting that invert data on their culverts. And it might be just the case that we just simply say, can we go out and get it ourselves because of the value? I mean, we have certain areas, the Shields Lake drainage area, we have modeled for that work that we did out at Shields Lake. And then we have committed to contributing to the downtown study area. And then, of course, the other areas out by 35 that are part of the Comfort Lake drainage area that we've initiated and completed. But for the rest of Forest Lake, which is still a very notable area, we would want to be on top of that, because if you had a 10+ inch event somewhere over Forest Lake, it could be pretty devastating. And I think it would just be nice, again, from a planning standpoint, emergency management tool, et cetera, to have that information in hand.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one more point?
Yep.
So, like you're noting, Mike, that we've had a lot of rain. So part of the scenario is the rainfall event and the changing rainfall events. But the other part of the problem is, what are our starting water levels? And what do the groundwater conditions look like? So for example, in Browns Creek, the groundwater levels are so high when we get even a small event or back-to-back rainfall events, we're starting to see flooding. So there's a lot of different drivers as we look out into the future, which is what adds to the complexity and makes this just a big issue. And so that was why we reached out to the Met Council to see what they were learning and what they thought the impacts of climate change would be to the groundwater system mid-century, end of century, so we can build some of those assumptions into the H&H model. Because there's not a good, easy way to figure out how what role groundwater plays in these rainfall events. How much capacity is there in the soil to take on some of that rainfall when it does fall, or is our ground now saturated, which, I think our ground is pretty saturated today after a couple of weeks of rain. So there's a lot of things that fall into these scenarios, and we will make recommendations on those as well.
So Camilla, are those things easily, I want to say modeled, but I don't think that's quite the right word, but set up in this GIS-based sort of high-level modeling tool before we get to the H&H model? But can we do those sorts of things in this GIS-based modeling environment, or is that just not really? We just throw water on the landscape and it spreads out wherever it spreads out, and we find high-risk areas, and maybe that forces us down the H&H path. I'm not quite sure.
The groundwater component would not be a part of the flood hazard assessment, and the groundwater component would be part of the H&H model, but we would have to make assumptions looking at what starting water levels are today, because they are higher now, right, than they have been 10 years ago. And we'd have to make assumptions about the moisture availability or the moisture content of the soils based on rainfall. But scenarios might be a 100-year 24-hour event or back-to-back 100-year events or those types of things.
Right. But the GIS-based assessment would allow us to find hotspots essentially on the landscape, and then focus on those hotspots to find out how hot are they and what are the real problems with those particular areas.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha. All right, other questions for Camilla or Megan or Mike? All right, thanks Camilla, thanks Megan.
Thank you very much for your questions and your time. I appreciate it.
All right, let's move on to the 2022 budget discussion.
Mr. President, managers, so you see the memo in the board packet. So Emily has been leading the development of the budget process so far, and so we've come up with a couple of scenarios that she's crafted for the board here for consideration. And I think that as we're suggesting at this point, that we ask the board for some higher level guidance in terms of budget development. So, Emily is obviously available for questions as well.
Okay, do we have any questions for Emily from the board?
Well, I guess I do have a couple thoughts, questions. One of the issues that was brought out by Emily was trying to balance the revenue versus the expenses by heavily tapping into our reserve fund. So I think that's an issue that we have to talk about. Does that make a lot of sense to put all the reserve money in one year, or should we actually be balancing that out, reducing it by bringing a loan in? So that's one thing I think we eventually have to talk about. The other issue is that we actually, in the 10-year plan, we have like a $5.6 million that we would want to spend next year, but we only got 3.8 in the budget. And so, and I guess we've decided that we were probably not going to spend the 5.6, but that we would pick and vote on which part of that 5.6 that we would spend in next year. And so how was that 3.8 determined? Was that your assessment of the highest priority projects that we had talked about for that year in the 10-year plan? So that's another question I had. The other option was that this year, in terms of spending our project money, we were way underspent, about 50% underspent. And so now next year, we're going to project that we're going to spend 3 times that amount next year. So we spent $700,000 this year, and we're going to spend over $2 million next year on projects. How is that going to get done? I guess with the state, do we have this EOR staff to do that? And I guess I raised this question below, but again, there's always reasons why projects don't get done. But having a better understanding of that issue, I think, would help us decide whether maybe we need to subcontract out to other vendors to make sure all this stuff gets done. So those are three questions I had, I guess, off the top of my head. Most of them brought out by Emily's letter to a certain extent. I don't know whether we want to discuss them now or
Yeah, I
obviously
think
you haven't had a chance to go through all the details. So these are pretty high level questions and issues that were brought up. And I'm sure Jackie has some thoughts on this too. So.
Yes, well, I don't think we should get into it tonight, quite frankly. I don't. I think that we were asked, we asked to have a preliminary budget presented to us. And we have it. And so it's going to take more than, I couldn't even look at this until late Monday. So more than a couple of days to put thoughts down on paper. But there are a number of things. And to the question that you asked, no to the first and modified yes to the second scenario. So you could put that where you want to, but do not drain the reserve fund. That's not what it's there for.
Right,
And-
I agree.
And the loan access that we have was not to my liking last year. I thought we were running a little bit too close to the edge when we got into the 6 months of waiting until the first tax period. But those are things that require more thought, and it requires some answers that people can read, not just verbal responses. So I'd like to move this discussion until the next meeting, which is June, whatever that is, June.
Yeah, the first
June
meeting in
8th,
June.
is it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
10th,
Tuesday.
10th. Yeah, June 10th.
I guess I would like Emily to answer one of Steve's questions about the selection of the $3.8 million versus the 5.6. So how was that done, and what was your thought process there?
Yeah, thanks. That was the one I was gonna try to tackle first. So yeah, basically we started with that 5.6 million that, last year we had gone through those workshops with the watershed management plan. And it was sort of like a wish list of, we've got a lot that we want to do in the next 10 years, kind of trying to figure out how the timing's going to shake out. And getting into it, and it's months later now that since we had those workshops for the 10-year budget, me, Megan, Mike, and other staff, both on our side and EOR, we realized that some of them maybe don't need to be done right away. There was a lot of upfront studies, like in the wetlands, upland resources, and groundwater that the board had talked about wanting to do of, before we start doing groundwater projects, let's do some baseline studies, let's do some information gathering. And so we had really put a lot of those in 2022, just right at the front of that 10-year budget. But getting into it, we thought, okay, maybe we should put those off for now, just because getting the budget to balance. So those are some that we were able to cut from 5.6 down. Another really big, just single line item was months ago when we were doing the 10-year budget, we had thrown in $300,000 for the district office space in 2022. But as we've progressed in that planning process over the last few months, we're realizing we're probably not ready to spend that large amount of money in 2022. And so that got reduced drastically too, and is really more of a planning expense than a go out and purchase a big old building or parcel quite next year, probably more 2023. Those are
That's
just
good.
a few of the broad strokes, I would say.
Yeah, that's good information to help us as we look at the budget in more detail of what choices you made and why you made them. So,
Well, I think this is an important step, though, to be discussed at the 10th meeting, is our priorities as a
Right.
board. If you're not going to do those foundational studies starting in 2022, then you're probably not going to be able to do much project work at all on those areas in the next 10-year plan, the one that we're working on right now to close. So it takes 4 or 5 years sometimes, depending upon the study that we're doing. Well, I mean, look at how long this H&H modeling has taken. It's 5 years. I think we're going on 5 years of this. So these take a long time. So you've got to set the priority for that investment so that you can have those projects coming up in the time frame that you want them in. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about that. And I want to just emphasize once again, the budgeting process is setting your priorities. The levy amounts or the approach that we started with was to do this in steps. not annual steps so much, but you take a big jump and then you're there for the next 4 or 5 year period. And it's based on, what your priorities are, what your emphasis is, what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I think we need to have a little bit more discussion on that before we can dive into the nuts and bolts of a budget. So that's what I'm hoping that we do on the 10th is set that foundation, because the rest becomes very easy once you lay those priorities out.
But I think if, just to make sure I understand, I know we have our 10-year plan and we have projects, we have that chart that shows projects for each of the 10 years in the 10-year plan, right?
Mhm.
So if the first year was 5.6 million, we have a list of those projects in the 10-year plan for that year. So we can go and see what's in the budget, what's not in the budget. And we can see what you guys have picked already, but haven't had a chance to do that because of the time constraints here. But that's kind of how it's organized, right? I mean, that logic should pertain all the way through. I also found this one chart very helpful, which you took us, we had asked for this last meeting, and you put together the projects that were not completed. And then you've shown how those are either carried forward or dropped. There's a draft 22 budget on this title. There's no other way to describe this chart. Not even a page number on it. So it's the one with projects in 2012 to 2021 water management plan that were not completed by the end of 2021. So that's what the chart is in the first column. I thought that was a very useful chart, although I don't completely understand the logic behind it. So that's something we also maybe should try to discuss at the next meeting, because it really shows what's moving forward and what's not, and maybe why. So
Yeah.
that's the chart. Yeah, that's it right there. Thank you.
So I assume then we're going to try to allocate a fair amount of the schedule for the June 10th meeting to more detailed budget discussions. So we'll want to be careful not to overload that meeting with a lot of other agenda items if possible. We may need to have a workshop or something.
I'd like to follow up on Jackie's suggestion that we actually decide what we're going to talk about at that meeting. So if you guys want to run by a couple attempts at, 3 or 4 topics, then we can get some agreement before we get into the meeting. Because obviously, Emily had her thoughts, I had some thoughts, and Jackie had her thoughts, and they didn't always line up too well. So as usual, right? Being all individuals.
Mhm.
So if you could put together 2 or 3, we have some suggestions here. If we could put together 2 or 3 topics and then send it out and see if we all agree or not. Or if we don't agree, we can maybe suggest something else and try to build that consensus before we get to the meeting, so we know exactly what we're going to talk about. And then we can all prepare for those 3 topics too, because we can't go through this whole thing, for each meeting.
Right.
So that's another suggestion that might help us be more efficient at the next meeting.
Yeah, it might be helpful to email Emily with your thoughts if you have specific things that you'd like to see covered at that
That's a
meeting.
good idea, right?
And have Emily sort of collate it, pull it together, send it out, and we can sort of refine it over the next 2 weeks and make sure we're headed in the right direction here.
But I think we want to start at a higher level, is what
Right.
Jackie suggested, right?
Right.
So I agree with that.
Right.
And work down, because there's some certain key issues that we got to resolve, as Manager Anderson pointed out, like the studies and that. We should get that decided early on.
Absolutely. Okay, anything else on the budget discussion this evening? Anything else that you need from us, Emily or Mike?
I think we can reach out if we think of things. I mean, we've talked about that, right? So, yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you're able to send me your suggested budget topics by, say, next Wednesday, I could even get them posted in the board packet. We'll post the board packet next Thursday.
Okay.
Mm.
Or just prior to the meeting, and we can bring it to the meeting.
Yeah,
We can keep refining it as we get closer to the meeting, but yeah, I mean, as soon as you got some ideas, send them to Emily. It's always easier to get them out there for more people to look at, but
Right.
yeah.
it takes thought. I mean, it takes some time to put it all together.
Where there's a holiday weekend in
Yep.
there too. So
Yep.
things aren't going to be, you're back down to 2 or 3 days.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
There's
Get all
not
this
much time
together.
between today and Thursday or
Right.
Wednesday. It's
Right.
really it's 2 days.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else on the budget discussion then? All right, watershed management plan update. Discussion.
Mr. President, managers, so I think we left, my understanding was that we left that May 18th workshop kind of on the same page about our responses to comments and everything. But then I realized that I didn't get the action. The board needs to actually take action to approve the responses to comments. So that's okay. We still have time to post them. I'll post it after the meeting tonight, and that'll be meeting that posting 10 days in advance of the public hearing, which is June 10th. So I had just cleaned up that comment response matrix. It's posted in the board packet. I don't think anything really too different than what we discussed. And so just the recommendation is to get that motion on the books, on the record.
Okay, any concerns about the comment response matrix that Emily had included in the board packet this evening? Are we ready?
I didn't have
approve?
didn't have a chance to look at it, John, in any detail because it's 19 pages long.
Right.
But having gone through it last meeting, there was a number of areas in there where we were awaiting input from Dan Fabian or from Bowser on certain topics. So have we got all that input in, and is it satisfactory to you that where it doesn't have to be discussed by the board anymore before it goes into that matrix? That was the only question I had, because there must have been 8 or 10 of those items that were hanging out there yet, not resolved.
Yeah, and most of those we had talked about with Dan, and I didn't even feel the need to discuss them on the 18th because and it was minor enough, we got clarification. And then the ones that were still lingering, we discussed on the 18th, and I felt we left that workshop feeling consensus. And so I don't think there's anything I'd recommend discussing tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Jackie, did you have any concerns or about the comment response matrix?
No, the discussion that we had on the Lake Association grant program, that might not be something that we could include in this plan. That's been put to rest. I've had I was going to talk about it at managers time, but I'll just talk about it now. There were several conversations between me and Dan via email. And then Chuck gave great clarification on the ability that districts have in making changes that don't meet the threshold of amendment. And that seemed to fit perfectly into what we're doing. And then the other thing I did was review the operational documents for our BMP or cost share programs, that we historically have been calling them. They're really grant programs with different focuses. But the nonprofit groups were included in our community grant program. Those documents are not clear, when you read them. They were done way back in Doug Thomas's days, so they do need some cleanup. And I've been editing some of those, and those should be ready to go. But the big thing is that the document for the application can be used just as it is. Okay. And so our lake associations that have interest in this, they can go through that community grant program, use the current application process. And what we need to do as a group is to reinstitute those review committees for each of these different grant programs. And I would suggest using the narrative that I provided on the concept of the grant program as just an explanation piece for that subset of the community grant. And so that should do it. But
right.
we're continuing to work on those, okay, over the next week or so.
But that's not part of the new watershed management plan. That's already covered by things that we already have.
Right, but we spent time talking about whether or
Right.
not we could go forward with that. And I was to investigate it, which I did, and there's my report on it. So that's not in here if anybody was concerned about that.
Right, right. Okay, so then I think we're ready to approve the 60-day comment response matrix. So if someone wants to make the motion.
Did we want to do that tonight, or I thought we were
I think
gonna
we have to.
give time to read through it? I thought you said there
Uh,
was time, Emily. Is there?
No,
Did I
It-
not hear that
well,
correctly?
Not a ton of time. We really need to post it no later than Memorial Day.
Okay.
And given the long weekend, I'd like to just post it
Oh.
tonight.
Sure. Okay.
and based on our discussion on the 18th and the things that we've already seen, we feel like we're aligned on the comments and responses.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any harm in approving the comments and responses. Just go into the 90-day review period then, and people will see what we've posted out there, and they can comment on that. I assume Bowser can anyway.
Mhm.
I'll make that motion unless Jackie's already made it.
No, I haven't. I'll second.
Okay, motion been made and seconded. Any other discussion? I'll call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Schmaltz,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. All right, we have adopted the comment response matrix, so. All right, next item, reports of staff. Mike.
Mr. President, managers, I noted earlier, I'd like to introduce two new staff members, Bobby Law and Nick Banks. I'll let them do a quick introduction. Bobby Law is our new office manager. Nick Banks is our senior land management coordinator. Go ahead, Bobby.
Hi guys, I'm Bobby, and I just came from the district. I worked with Mike Eisensee at Carmar, so some of you might recognize me from some workshops, but yeah, I'm really excited to be here. So yeah.
Welcome.
Welcome. Yes.
Good to have you on board.
All right.
Good evening, Mr. President and Board. I'm Nick Banks. Prior to coming to the Watershed District here, I was working for the Minnesota Land Trust for the last 7 years roughly. And if you're kind of familiar with that organization, they actually had their origins in Washington County back in 1991 and have a lot of conservation easements in the county. I think actually they might have the most conservation easements in Washington County of all the counties across the state that they work in, but operated in the nonprofit world then for the last 7 years, working with private landowners and other conservation entities, mainly to do protection work across different parts of the state and primarily through the form of conservation easements. I was responsible for working in basically the southern half of the state, and then kind of up in the Sauk River watershed, if you're familiar with that area, and Avon Hills, which is in Stearns County, there was the Land Trust's smallest program area. And excited to be here and getting to work with the staff in the board on the Greenways program, and also be having some responsibilities with permitting.
Good, welcome.
Nice to have you on board.
Yeah, good. Looking forward to meet you personally one of these days.
Mhm.
Likewise.
Yeah, we've thrown them both in, not feet first, but maybe head first. So with plenty. At some point soon, we'll let them a step away from the fire hose and take a breath. But right now, yeah, we got a lot going on, and glad to have them on board. Yeah, otherwise, just really with my report, a lot of activity with partnerships right now. I think that has been a continuum through the pandemic, as that Zoom meetings, you can have back to back to back. I had 4 of them today, about 6+ hours, 6.5 hours worth, but and that's fine. The Lower St. Croix piece, the subcommittee meetings have commenced, and I see that going. Had one yesterday, one today, and those are going to be interesting. I know Manager Anderson attended the policy committee on Monday, so thank you for that. And otherwise, we're trying to look forward to the next round of Clean Water Fund grant applications due in August and what that might look like. So we've been starting to develop some of those, and Garrett gave a nice update on on the AIS activities. So otherwise, I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Questions for Mike? All right. Thanks, Mike. All right, Smith Partners, or not Smith Partners, sorry, EOR. I skipped you guys.
I'll give the Smith Partners update.
Oh, I can give that too.
Mr. President, managers, kind of in the program level, one thing to note from our engineers report in the packet, when I put it together, which was Wednesday afternoon, at that point, there had been no significant rainfall events, but in the last week, we were out last Thursday and again this afternoon, collecting water quality samples at our long-term sites and then also at our Forest Lake diagnostic sites. And then really there's been a lot of project support going on. We've assisted district staff with some project design just west of Forest Lake, or Fourth Lake, apologize, as part of the Bone Lake Swale implementation grant. We completed all that feasibility level design work for the Bone Lake Northeast wetland restoration, which is now ordered. We'll move on to final design. For the County Road 50 iron enhanced sand filter, now that we've made more progress, or the district has made a lot of great progress on the landowner agreement, we've moved into coordinating and scheduling all the field work that needs to occur so that we're ready to go with that feasibility level design. And then there's been several just land acquisition opportunities that the district has had their hands on. So we're just providing some minor support to get those parcels under review and in consideration.
Questions for Megan? Thanks, Megan. All right, Smith Partners, Chuck.
Mr. Chair, nothing to add to Dr. Funke's Smith Partners report.
Perfect. All right, report of treasurer, Steve.
Okay, we have income for the coming month, this past month of $428,000, $751.13, and most of that came from Bowser grants that we received. So I would say over 90% of that. And as far as expenses for this month, we've got expenses of $192,780.08. And I asked the board to approve payment of those bills. Thank you.
I'll make the motion to accept the treasurer's report and pay the bills.
I will second the motion. Any other discussion? All right, I will call the question. Manager Anderson.
Aye.
Manager Smalls.
Aye.
Manager Spence. Aye. All right.
Signing checks tomorrow?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to ask that.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because Jessica's not here, so we should get that resolved.
That'll
Right.
be with me.
Yep. Bobby will be in the office. So
Okay.
just wanted to schedule the times for the board members.
Okay. Jackie? your
Yeah.
pleasure?
What time do you get in, Bobby?
I will be there at 8 a.m.
Good. I'll be there at 8:10.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you.
I'll be in about a half hour after that, then around 9 o'clock for me then. Thank
Oh,
you.
sounds good.
All right. Okay, report of officers and managers. Manager Smalls.
Nothing to report. Thank you.
Manager Anderson.
Well, I just want to report that it was Mike that made me 1 minute late getting to the meeting today. We were talking right beforehand. We haven't had a chance to touch base since the One Watershed One Plan Policy Committee meeting. So I was just bringing him up to speed, and he was bringing me up to speed on some of the meetings that just followed the subcommittee meetings. But it went as expected. It was a little bit shorter than the 2 hours, so about an hour and a half, I think. And there were two statements that we wanted to bring out, questions or comments. And one, Mike wanted me to bring up the T as a measurement for soil loss, and that be a criteria for getting agricultural dollars. And that did not go over well. And he had more conversation at one of the subcommittees he was at this week, so he can talk to you more about that. But it didn't pass, and so farmers are getting 100% contribution to the project. And my concern was that in the criteria for reporting, the starting point is a modeled number for phosphorus reduction or phosphorus in the water body. And they're not going to insist that the partners where these projects are being done provide some dollars toward the effectiveness monitoring. And so if there is none, they are going to model the outcome. And so I said it twice and asked if that is really what we want to be doing. And everybody was agreed that that is what we want to be doing because there's no money for it. So in other words, there's not enough money in the fund for the grant dollars to pay for everything. So there was very little discussion about commitment from the partners. So that was disappointing, but not unexpected. And the other thing that was a little disappointing is the plan was to have monthly meetings in the implementation, the first year of implementation of the plan. But we've gone, I think we had one break in that so far this year, but we're now moving to every other month. And so the next meeting will be in July and then the following meeting in September. And there may not be one in November. And so the staff and the lead people are, running the show now with going to be very little oversight by the policy committee. So that's how it went. And the next meeting, like I said, isn't going to be until July, and it's just going to be reports on what's been done by the staff and the partners that are implementing the projects. We did hire someone, I might have reported this at the last meeting, for the outreach coordinator position to help Angie. She's very experienced and I think she's going to be great. And so that's in place. And we had a lot of, I think I did mention this, we had 63 applications. And that was whittled down to 23 by Jay and Angie. And then the subcommittee met and we interviewed 8 people and did those in 4-hour segments over 2 days. And they're very highly qualified, all of them. It was a tough decision, but I think we made the right one, and we've got the best person. So I'm looking forward to that. They're still working on the agronomist position. Mike, you probably know more about that, but they haven't hired anyone just yet. They are looking at the potential of contracting. I think that was one of our suggestions last year. And so they are talking with the University of Minnesota Extension Service to see if they would hire someone and oversee that, or if they have someone that could be contracted with. So other than that, there is one statement that I wanted to share with you in the discussion with the policy committee. It was mentioned, and very proudly, that this plan is going to result in 256 pounds of phosphorus reduction per year and 295 tons of sediment per year. And that sounds like a great deal, but over the 10-year period, we're looking at 2,560 pounds of phosphorus removal. So on a $15 million plan. So take that for what it is, which is inadequate in our minds. But anyway, that's what it is, and they're happy about it. And so we're on the train, whether we like it or not. Okay, that's it.
All right. I just wanted to report that we are closing on our house on July 7th. So as of July 7th, I will no longer be a homeowner in the district. And Chisago County is moving to replace me. They announced it at the most recent board meeting that I was resigning and that they needed to fill the position. So they let the other commissioners know that it's just someone from southern Chisago County in the affected areas. And I believe we have at least one applicant already, or if that person hasn't applied, they will soon. So there may be other applicants out there, but they are moving. I don't know how long their process takes to replace a board member. I don't know if they wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or what, till they have enough applicants and then move it forward at that point. But they may have a replacement in time for one of the July meetings, if not maybe one of the August meetings. So, but you will be at only 3 managers strength, it looks like, for some period of time in the summer. So sorry about that, folks, but I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to sell my house right now. So,
Did you say July 7th or June 7th?
July 7th.
Okay,
Yep, so I'll be here for all the meetings in June,
okay,
but I'll miss all the meetings that are currently scheduled in July,
sure,
because the first one is the 8th. So.
okay.
All right. Board direction. Chuck.
Mr. Chair, managers, I don't have very much. In the budget discussion, managers are going to email proposed agenda items, budget agenda topics to Emily, who will refine and communicate about that to the board in advance of the next meeting. And otherwise, in the floodplain vulnerability discussion, there was a lot of discussion about next steps to advance the work with the district's communities, but I did not hear any specific direction given to staff or EOR on that.
On which one was that, Chuck? The
floodplain vulnerability modeling and GIS work.
Well, there was that whole discussion about let's getting what we have available for some kind of predictive modeling demonstration. So I would note that for sure.
Yeah. Put together some sort of a demo, modeling demo.
Yes, that was in my notes for EOR staff to follow up on in coordination with Mike Kinney.
Yep. All right, anything else that anyone noted? All right, then I believe a motion to adjourn is in order this evening.
I'll make that motion.
Second,
Motion's been made and seconded. Any other discussion? Call the roll. Manager Anderson,
aye.
Manager Schmaltz,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. We are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Good reports
Thanks, everyone.
tonight from
Good night.
EOR. Thank you.
Aye.
You're welcome. Have a
Thanks.
great night. Enjoy the weekend.
Aye.
Mhm.
Have a great weekend, guys.
Yeah, that's right.
Bye,
Welcome, new people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Aye.
Bye.